rogue slugs. The riot lasted for several more days, eventually dying down once the remaining Kurds made their way out of the city. Remember when companies used to host special giveaways, find a golden ticket and win a big old truck, or be the millionth customer and win a lifetime supply of used toenail clippings? They don't really do those anymore, and for good reason. Something that the Pepsi Corporation would find out the hard way in 1992. In order to hook new customers onto their delicious and nutritious sugary soda, Pepsi held a contest in the Philippines. The Pepsi Number Fever Contest. Bottle caps of Mountain Dew, 7-Up, Mirinda, and of course Pepsi would each have a number printed underneath them ranging from 1 to 999. It was up to customers to collect these bottle caps and wait to see what numbers were announced as winners of various prizes. These were either small monetary or free product prizes, but the grand prize was a whopping 1 million Philippine pesos. This equated to about $40,000 in 1992, or about $92,000 in 2025 money. This was, at the time, equivalent to about 51 times the average annual salary in the Philippines, so it was a pretty big deal. Pepsi saw their monthly sales in the area balloon 40% as people scrambled for their chance at wealth. New prizes and winning numbers were announced each night on television and radio, and the people would redeem whatever prizes they won. The entire promotion ran from February into May of '92. By the end of the run, over 51,000 different prizes were awarded, including 17 lucky winners of the grand prize. But unfortunately, everyone's luck was about to run out, or at least to them, it would seem like their luckiest day of their lives. As a side note, when companies hold sweepstakes like this, they set aside a specific budget and plan out how many winners of each prize there will be to spend that budget. For the Pepsi Number Fever contest, it was $2 million. They had already made that back in the first few weeks of the promotion, but once the budget was spent, then the promotion was over. On May 25th, another grand prize winning number was announced, 349. Since this was a grand prize, only 2 bottle caps bearing the winning number were supposed to be in circulation. There were more. A lot more. Thanks to an oopsie in the manufacturing department, over 800,000 bottles were distributed with the number 349 under the cap. So, in theory, Pepsi was now on the hook for over $32 billion in prizes, almost triple what the entire Pepsi company was worth at the time. Fleets of Filipino fellas and fellettes flocked to their local Pepsi bottling plants to redeem their fortune, but were confused when they saw everyone else with the same supposed winning number. To make matters worse, the company retracted the number, correcting it to 134 the next morning. All of the top Pepsi executives held an emergency meeting to decide a course of action. They agreed to eat into the promotion's profits and count it as a wash. But for 800,000 people, this meant that they could only forfeit about $18 a person. Nearly 500,000 accepted, but 300,000 did not. Thousands of irate individuals banded together, forming the 349 Alliance with the goal of boycotting Pepsi products and eventually receiving their promised prizes. But that wouldn't happen. Over the next several months, numerous small riots broke out, destroying dozens of Pepsi delivery trucks and endangering Pepsi employees. Unfortunately, an extremist protester lobbed a live grenade in a warehouse, popping 3 bottle plant workers in the process. Another device that was hucked at a Pepsi truck ended up taking the lives of a local school teacher and a 5-year-old girl. Yellow. Legal actions against Pepsi persisted up until 2006, where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Pepsi, absolving them of any future liability for the contest. The contest was a good idea in theory, but it ended up fizzing out and falling flat.
With Google Play Games, you can play unlocked. Unlock big deals on the biggest games. Deals Week is here. Don't miss out. Go play on mobile and PC with Google Play Games. Download now.
He's out. You whipped his. No, it's a.
The hardest thing is to get started. You have to get it on paper.
Now,
We have started to deal with computers with higher and higher levels of abstraction.
Just push a button.
Rapid prototyping allows you to identify what's important early on. People then end up spending more time finding decisions of what they want to actually make.
You could fly the bathroom.
It's pronounced Palingopur, and it's ridiculous. Also known as the Eel Riot, this little event is quite the hidden gem in the history of Amsterdam. Let me introduce you to Palingtrekken, a rather curious Dutch pastime. It involves a bunch of your closest friends, a long rope, and a lubed-up live eel. Your imagination filling in the blanks a little bit there? Well, allow me to paint a picture. Freaky-deaky Dutch dudes would spend summer afternoons attempting to grab a live eel from a rope draped across either a canal or trees while standing in boats or on horseback, respectively. Pull on the dangling devil and be declared a winner. But if you miss your swing, you'll end up losing more than just your balance. It was a fun Dutch tradition for hundreds of Dutch years, until the Dutch government, being the Dutch oven that it was, laid down the Dutch law. Deemed an act of unnecessary cruelty, the practice was banned in the mid-19th century, but that wouldn't deter the population from yanking their eels in public. One fateful day in July of 1886, a group of young labormen were looking to trekken some paling on the Lindelgracht Canal in the impoverished Amsterdam neighborhood of Jordaan. A few local policemen caught the men in the act, being all, absolutely not, but like, in Dutch. One officer sprang into action, cutting the rope across the canal and putting an end to the game. So the laborers put an end to him. The officer was dragged into a nearby cellar and had the ever-loving shit beat out of him. The other officers fled for backup, but this only escalated the situation. Deeming the act of cutting the rope more as an act of oppression rather than punishment, the young men rallied nearly the whole neighborhood, forming a bloodthirsty mob. They fussed about for hours, clashing against police reinforcements, but when nightfall hit, everyone kind of called it a day and went sleepy by. The entire neighborhood awoke the very next morning refreshed, but still fuming, so they armed themselves with sticks and stones to break some bones. They regrouped and stormed the local police station to vent their frustrations. They began to pelt officers with rocks, sticks, bigger rocks, literal garbage. Whatever they could get their hands on, it became a projectile. Knowing that peace was not an option, the officers called in military support. But even while staring down a well-armed army, the mob would not falter. The army decided to calm the rioters down with some live ammunition. Once the smoke had settled, 26 lay dead with 130 injured. But the eel was okay.
It's gonna be hard if you have it all.
Stupid deadly trends in history.
Keep your feet out.
So social trends are a thing. Whether it's collecting the latest useless collectible or partaking in the how many dehydrated baby carrots can you shove into your butthole challenge, there's no avenue that humanity won't venture in order to fulfill our lives with something to ooh and ah at. And it's been that way since the dawn of man. Take, for instance, flagpole sitting. It's exactly as boring as it sounds, but for the dopamine-deprived people of yore, this was the bee's knees. The practice of posteriors perpetually planted on pillars and poles was prevalent as far back as the 5th century. Back then, a bunch of Christian dudes called stylites would make it their mission to live atop tall pillars, with the term stylites deriving from the Greek stylos, quite literally meaning pillar or column. Now, this wasn't for social entertainment, but rather for the salvation of their soul. Perhaps history's most well-known stylite was Simeon the Stylite. He believed that by living all uncomfy and uncozy atop his tall little pillar palace in Syria, with minimal sustenance and constant exposure to the elements, he would essentially cast away his mortal self. All that remains would be his immortal soul, ready for a first-class ticket to the heavens beyond. Because I guess God loves watching his creations mercilessly punish themselves for good boy points. According to some historical sources, Simeon remained perched on his pillar for as long as 42 years until his death. Real commitment to the bit. Fast forward tens of billions of seconds into the future, and the practice of pole sitting made a comeback in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. Only this time, it was to draw a crowd. Like any trend, it all began with one person. this person, semi-professional stuntman Alvin Kelly. Reportedly the result of a friendly dare, Kelly's first publicized climb was in 1924, where he sat for several hours outside a department store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Excuse me, what's with that guy up there? Buy some slacks, don't forget to buy a hat. He's no one. Welcome to the store. Enjoy yourself. Hey, come on, get down from there. No, I'm not gonna ask again. What are you gonna do? Come up here and make me? Yeah, that's what I thought. Hey, guess what? What? Kelly's successful marketing campaign actually bloomed into a career. He would use his questionable talent to promote things like movie premieres or sporting events, but eventually became the main spectacle himself, touring 28 cities across the country where people actually bought tickets to watch dudes sit atop a pole for hours on end. Do a flip. His personal best was a cheek-numbing 49 days in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All of this fame and attention paved the way for others to take up the trend, from amateur backyard enthusiasts like Little Lenny here to full-time professional pole sitters like your mom. But of course, nothing lasts forever. The fad began dying out when several people started to die off thanks to that great big depression that happened in the 1930s. It's hard to laugh at someone struggling and starving on a pole 200 feet in the air when you're struggling and starving at ground level. By its very nature, the stunt of pole sitting was extremely dangerous. You had to balance yourself properly through sleep deprivation, harsh weather, and lack of nutrition. One slip or overcorrection was enough to convert all of your potential energy into kinetic energy as you gave onlookers a direct demonstration of gravitational acceleration.
What?
Well, there he goes.
Wanna buy,
There was
dude?
at least one verifiable death directly related to the act. Granted, this was decades later in the 1970s. The
wanna
unlucky
buy
fellow who
two.
took the fall was 72-year-old professional
Oh,
bowler
speaking of
Richard
which,
Blandy.
da buy two,
Dear-old
remember?
Dick spent a record-breaking
Yeah, those are good.
125 days atop a pole in Stockholm, Sweden, just 9 years prior, surviving mostly on whiskey and 3 packs of cigarettes a day, or as I like to call it, the stepdad special. Then things hit a wall for Richard, or in this case, the ground. In 1974, while finishing up a 4-day promotional sitting at Dixie Square Mall in Harvey, Illinois, a trailer accidentally reversed into his tower, causing it to collapse and Richard to plummet to his death. Remember, the higher the heights you reach, the longer the fall from the top.
Introducing the new Knit and Sew Shop at Michael's. Explore thousands of fabric styles. and
No,
thousands
not
of
today.
Now, fabric is available in over 800 stores nationwide. Shop the new Knit and Sew Shop, only at Michael's. Everything to create.
Familiar with this one. Venetian ceruse was a specific type of cosmetic concoction used throughout the 16th century in Europe. The main purpose of this product was to lighten the complexion of many a fine fella or fellette. It also served to cover up blemishes and give a refined, flawless look. Since most of my guys are drawn as white as a cheese and mayonnaise sandwich, we need to travel back in time. Believe it or not, the desire to appear pale as paste actually stretches as far back as 2000 BC with the ancient Egyptians. Well, the rich ones anyway. You see, getting all tanned and toned under the hot sun all day was a sign that you were a filthy, hard-working poor. Not wanting to look like they partook in any labor, Egyptian nobles slapped lead-based powder all over their faces to get that DoorDash enthusiast look. You know, the look of royalty. The desire for a paler complexion traveled across the Mediterranean into ancient Greek territory where, again, upper-class folks took it upon themselves to whiten their skin and cover up any skin imperfections. The trend continued on to influence ancient Rome and even ancient China, all of which stuck to the lead-based recipe. Jump into the futuristic years of the 16th century, and the beauty standard still remained, and that's about the time that Venetian ceruse entered the fray. Perhaps one of the most notable historical figures that dabbled in the dust was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The exact cause of her death is debated, but historians speculate her kicking of the royal bucket to have been a severe blood infection brought on by heavy use of her lead-based Venetian ceruse makeup. She not only used the powder to minimize any melanistic manifestations, but to cover up severe scarring from her smallpox. It also was just the fashion at the time. If you take a look at a lot of Renaissance paintings from the era, you're going to see a lot of disturbingly white faces. It was the epitome of beauty. I mean, nowadays some people obsess over looking like dumbass balloon animals, so it's not all that outlandish. The most well-documented death directly from Venetian ceruse use was debatably beautiful babe Countess Maria Coventry. Her heavy use of the stuff caused her own skin to crack and peel, forming painful open sores that she just covered up with more makeup. She bit the dust in 1760 at the age of just 27. So what exactly was it made of and why was it so toxic? Well, first of all, it's lead. Lead's not good for you, especially not being plastered onto your skin for hours or days on end. The lead isn't even white, I hear you scream into your screen. But white lead is. This is white lead. See how white it is? Pretty freaking white. This is hydroceracite, a lead salt compound also called lead carbonate hydroxide. It's naturally occurring, usually found alongside the pure lead deposits. So some Venetian fellas in Venice decided to mine the stuff, mash it up, and mix it with water and vinegar to create a paste. It was found to have incredible drying properties, so it was actually first used in the 16th century as a medical product, being applied to icky, sticky, oozing open sores and wounds to suck up the juices. But then I guess someone got a little experimental and realized it could be a great cosmetic as well.
Would you frig me? I'd frig me.
The problem, though, with long-term lead exposure is that it sort of leaches through the skin and into your blood, causing lead poisoning, and any condition with the word poisoning in it naturally doesn't have pretty side effects. According to the World Health Organization, severe lead poisoning can cause a wide variety of symptoms, none of them pleasant. You have your basic nausea and vomiting, sure, but you also have crippling headaches, memory loss, the big sad, and even high blood pressure in the short term. As for the long term, we're talking reproductive issues and even permanent brain and nervous system damage. The neurological effects often led to increased aggression, hyperactivity, and the lowering of one's IQ. So in scientific conclusion, heavy lead makeup was creating a bunch of irritated, angry, infertile morons. Just like those dang insert political party here. Am I right? Humans have been nodding their noggins and tapping their toes ever since first discovering a beat.
Off my couch.
And the act of rocking out usually lasts for several songs, which is normal, but how would you feel about dancing for days on end? Well, it happened. Dance marathons were all the rage back in the 1920s in the United States, but Americans actually have the British to thank for that. In February of 1923, professional dance couple Ollie and Edgar took it upon themselves to cut a British rug for 7 hours straight. This was something that, historically speaking, had never really been done before, and it caught some national attention. But in true American fashion, the British were about to be one-upped. Alma Cummings, a New York dance instructor who became fascinated with the idea of testing human limits while revolutionizing human expression, set a blistering 27-hour dance record just 12 days after the Brits tried to be good at something. I mean, look at that. She put holes in her soles, for God's sake. Something was happening within the United States in the 1920s. If you recall, the flagpole sitting craze was also hitting its stride at this point in time. Americans became obsessed with record-breaking feats of human physical endurance. So publicity stunts became the norm as normal humans tried pulling off superhuman endeavors. I'm gonna lift this car. So after Alma busted her move, the idea of endurance dancing began to take off. Within the next few weeks, her record had been broken 9 times across the country, so everyone was getting into the swing of things. It became a public spectacle, with promoters hosting dancing marathons as a form of entertainment. Pay a 25-cent fee, and you could just watch people shimmy, shimmy, shimmy to the break of dawn. Several dawns, actually. You see, it didn't take long for the craze to drop a ranked mode. Competitive dancing marathons saw couples boogieing for days on end to get a chance at solid cash prizes. Those prizes became even more valuable once the world entered the Great Depression in the 1930s. In a collapsed economy, these marathons were seen not only as a form of entertainment for the now destitute masses, but a means of survival. That's because participants were properly fed and sheltered in exchange for their performance, all while still having that chance at a grand prize. These prizes could range from a couple hundred to a couple $1,000. Now, considering that the median income in the 1930s was roughly $1,000 a year, this was a big deal. So dancing devolved from entertainment to desperation. Competitors were allowed only short breaks in between numbers to catch their breaths, but they were still required to move and groove in some form, be it a tap of the foot or a nod of the head. Couples that stayed still for too long were actually prodded with sticks or splashed with water to get them back on their feet again, lest they be disqualified and thrown to the streets.
You, just you, building your app on base 44. Describe it. And it's real. One thought.
Ted, what are you
leads to
doing?
more thoughts. Layer by layer, taking shape. When you need your tools, bring them in.
My stuffy.
They just click. Okay, kick it up a notch.
The most famous dance champions of the age were handsome stud muffin Callum de Villiers and beautiful babe Vani Kuczynski. So take a guess. How long do you think that their record-breaking dance lasted
A
for?
week.
Time's up. The answer was a heel-evaporating 157 consecutive days. Over 5 months of throwing down on the dance floor. Their prize? $1,000. Almost $25,000 in today's money. To no surprise, these endurance events were not without consequence. Like I said, people fully exhausted themselves to the point of collapse. Staying in the contest meant that you had food, water, and shelter for as long as you kept shaking that thing. Unfortunately, this resulted in a few reported deaths across the nation, one of the first being 27-year-old Homer Morehouse. No, not this guy. What, you want to see an actual picture of a dude who danced himself to death? You sicken me. Just an amateur dancer, Homer had reportedly been throwing it back for 87 hours straight, suffering from malnutrition and extreme sleep deprivation. He stumbled to a chair to take a break and fell over dead. News of these deaths caused immediate nationwide banning of dance marathons when they realized that, albeit voluntary human torture, isn't all that humane. But when promoters were raking in tens of thousands of dollars per event, stacks of cold hard cash outweighed the stacks of cold hard bodies. Hold on to your piggies, because this one's gonna cause some toes to curl. As a warning, there will be some gross feet pics somewhere in this section. Now, if you'll forgive my attempt at Chinese pronunciation, we'll get right into it. The practice of foot binding, or Jiansu, dates all the way back to the Imperial China days, with scholars failing to fully agree on any one origin story. Some claim the practice to have existed in the 6th century, but most point towards the 10th century under the Tang Dynasty. It is believed that a concubine of unsurpassed beauty was the first to bind her feet, though of course, not by choice. Lumpy Dumpling Emperor Li Yu commanded the aforementioned concubine Yao Yang to wrap her feet in white silk to resemble the crescent moon. She then performed a fancy dance atop a golden lotus statue. The emperor stood in awe at the grace and elegance of the woman's dance, so naturally other women of status wanted to imitate it. Women would force their feet into unnatural positions with the goal of creating what were later referred to as lotus feet. You know, like the flower, small, delicate, and beautiful. The teeny tiny tootsies were reportedly highly desirable, as Chinese men thought that this shit was undeniably sexy. Now, some historians believe that the real reason was a bit more selfish. See, this is what a real lotus foot looks like underneath the shoe. Scrumptious, right? Now imagine trying to walk around on those things all day. The reality of it was that walking on permanently disfigured feet meant excruciating pain. This resulted in women walking very daintily and slow, if at all. It has been suggested that the act of binding, while convincing women that it was to attract suitable partners, was actually a form of control, with men limiting the mobility of their wives. This would, in a sense, bind them to their homes just as their feet were bound to their shoes. This forced these women into sedentary, boring lives with nothing more to do than menial labor such as weaving and tapestry to help with the household income. Alright, but just how crunched in were them things, you may be asking yourself? And the answer is pretty friggin' crunched. Ideally, the foot was to be no longer than 4 inches or 10 centimeters in length. Ironically, the whole process was no small feat. Over the course of several months or even years, the toes would be repeatedly broken and tightly tucked under the sole, with the entire foot folded downward to achieve the desired effect. Unfortunately, it's a sad reality that innumerable Chinese women faced across the centuries. Well, no, actually, it wasn't just grown women, but young girls too. I'm talking as young as just 4 or 5 years old. Gotta fold and mold them feet while they're still growing. You ever go on the Living with the Land ride at Disney's Epcot and see the neat Mickey-shaped pumpkins growing? It's the same principle, but with human feet. The binding of youthful feet was not only practical from a physical standpoint, but a disciplinary one as well. It trained young girls to realize that life is pain, as well as the importance of abiding by societal rules and customs. This practice persisted from the 10th century all the way up to the 19th century. By then, it's estimated that nearly half of all Chinese women had their feet bound to some degree. If it wasn't obvious, all that cracking and crunching of the feet didn't exactly come with health benefits. The forced deformation commonly resulted in ulcerations, nasty sores resulting from the cracking open of skin, which were very difficult to treat properly. These led to deadly bacterial infections and gangrene, sometimes requiring the full amputation of the affected foot. Refuse to cut off one foot, and you can end up 6 underground. Foot binding started to fall out of favor towards the beginning of the 20th century. By this time, mass-produced textiles began taking over, leaving the perpetually working-from-home women to be out of a job. So they finally put their foot down. After exhaustive women's rights campaigns, the Chinese government took a step in the right direction by formally banning binding in 1949.
Hey, Bubba, would you count this as broken since it's like there's a crack on like this whole leg?
No, it's not broken. You can still use it. Just be careful.
Now, when you've got something that's beyond repair, do you ever just make the decision to break it a bit more to give it that sense of finality? Maybe just hucking a busted light bulb into a garbage can to hear a satisfying shatter? I have a deep garbage can. Well, gosh damn it, they did the same thing to full-size locomotives back in the day. Yep, if you had yourself a free afternoon and some spare change, you could waddle your britches on down to an isolated part of the plains to witness yourself a genuine high-speed train crash. But why? Because it looked cool. Come on, I know that when you cruise on down the freeway and notice a wreck on the side of the road, you're going to be whipping your big dumb head around to see the extent of the damage. We all do it. That's why we have traffic. But that curiosity and wonder is what drew crowds of tens of thousands of spectators throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. The premise was simple. Beginning in 1895, railroad organizers figured out a way to profit off of decommissioning their equipment. Train engines deemed obsolete either by being outdated or having otherwise unrepairable mechanical issues were placed on a long stretch of track facing each other. Onboard engineers would then set the locomotives full steam ahead before abandoning ship.
Step on the gas.
Allowing them to become a physical demonstration of physics. Spectators happily tossed a few of their hard-earned bucks to witness such a staged catastrophe. They were about as excited as a Second Amendment enthusiast experiencing his first home invasion. The problem, though, is that public safety measures at the time weren't much more than just standing back a ways while the trains did their thing. Nowadays, it's common for crowds to gather at scheduled demolition sites to watch tall buildings no longer be tall. But even at a bare minimum, safety nets are placed in front of the crowds to catch any rogue debris. Think about it. Even a small stone zooming on through at hundreds of miles an hour can mean instant death. Well, that would have been a welcomed consideration in 1896. Just north of Waco, Texas, was the now infamous Crash at Crush, a staged train wreck that was more than what the crowd had bargained for. The planned crash was to occur at the town of Crush. Crash at Crush. Make sense now? The temporary town was built specifically for the event, with an expected crowd of 20,000 Texans. But thanks to effective advertising, 40,000 showed up, eagerly awaiting to see themselves a tasty train wreck. Now, this should have been an omen that things weren't going to go as planned, but double the crowd meant double the doubloons and the pantaloons, so the event stuck to schedule. The two trains were put in place and sent on their way, topping out speeds at 50 miles an hour. The steam engines collided, as expected. But upon impact, the boilers violently exploded, not as expected. The explosion launched shrapnel in every direction, which naturally included where the crowd was standing. Well, butter my buns and call me a biscuit. I don't think that was supposed to happen. You know what? I think you're right. In addition to dozens of Southern fellas sustaining some bumps and bruises from flying hunks of metal, at least 2 Texans unfortunately yeed their last haw. But surprisingly, the crowd didn't flee. Instead, they ran towards the wreckage to assess the damage and grab themselves a souvenir from the pile of twisted metal. After all, they did pay to see a wreck, so they were going to get their money's worth. Despite the widespread report of the tragedy, the public didn't seem to care. In fact, these stunts only got more and more popular. Events kept chugging along well into the 1930s, when the trend finally crashed and burned.
This war reaches beyond the front lines. From the fields and foundries, the cities in the sky, to the
Horrifying Victorian fashion trends. The Victorian age. Great Britain's King William IV dies of death in 1837, and his 18-year-old niece Victoria takes the throne. This era marked a huge turning point in the history of the British Empire. Slavery had just been abolished, stricter labor laws were seeing less children getting smeared in gears, industry was booming, and literacy and education were on the rise. Sure, there was still overwhelming poverty and disease, but, you know, one step at a time. Another aspect that became a main focal point during the Victorian age was that of modesty. Ironically enough, the idea of modesty, at least for the upper class, was flexing as much wealth as possible. The easiest way to do that was by how you dressed. It was a quick way to tell anyone crossing your path what your status was. For instance, when you're out in public and you see a dude decked out in Supreme brand everything, you know without a doubt that that guy is a douche. You know when you watch movies or shows that depict the rich and the royals and you always see them wearing those big bulky dresses? Well, they were a very real fashion trend in the mid-19th century. Women would have layer after layer of dress slammed onto them to achieve that iconic bell-shaped look. I mean, these things were sometimes up to 8 layers thick. So while dudes were rocking simple coats and slacks, some women were drowning in their dresses, which, depending on the material type, could weigh upwards of 30 pounds. Help! Thankfully, in 1856, a Parisian inventor came through with a product designed to lighten the load, the crinoline cage. A large brace fitted under a single dress layer that gave all of the desired poof with far less pain. Reducing the overall weight burden by up to 75%, the structure was fashioned from lightweight steel rings strapped together to form the desired shape. With less layers to worry about, dresses could be exaggerated further with wider, fuller, and frankly ridiculous proportions, with dresses commonly reaching up to 6 feet in diameter. I mean, them things are girth. It wasn't long until the crinoline craze completely flooded the market, and thanks to that whole industrial revolution thing going on, articles of clothing that took weeks of handcrafting could now be mass-produced for pence on the pound, meaning that even higher-end fashion could be enjoyed across all societal classes, albeit with cheaper materials. But while the dresses offered women a more acceptable mobility to style ratio, it came with a few inherent dangers. The first and most obvious was the sheer size. Although they were looking fine as hell, women found the dresses to be flat out inconvenient. Getting on and off public transportation, taking up space in small shops and rooms, constant trips and falls, it became a public nuisance. In an act of horrible judgment, some women took the trend into the workplace, the highly industrialized, full of moving parts workplace. Now, if you're familiar with any videos watermarked with a Live Leak logo, you know that loose fabric and heavy machinery do not mix. According to an 1864 Irish newspaper, a young worker woman passed by an unguarded, steam-powered 4-inch mechanical shaft. Her dress was snagged and she was instantly entangled and mangled in the shaft for 3 whole minutes before the machine could be stopped. Oops. Her spine was snapped in multiple spots and she died shortly after. Now, since mangled corpses can negatively affect productivity, factories began banning the dresses on the floor. The other danger, of course, was fire. You know, that very element that drove every aspect of human life at the time. Heat, fireplaces, light, oil lamps and candles, machinery, steam boilers. Fire was everywhere, and these crinoline-clad ladies were essentially walking kindling. Now, thousands, I shit you not, thousands of deaths were reported as a result of crinoline dresses catching fire and engulfing their wearers. So while there were documented deaths on the individual,
I don't
level,
have
like
Science
14-year-old
Olympiad today.
kitchen maid Margaret Davy, whose dress ignited while reaching for
No,
spoons on
because
a
there's only
fireplace
9
mantle,
days
or
of it.
16-year-old Emma Musson, who burst into
Yes,
flames after a
it was
spark
done
from a
last
nearby kitchen
month.
fire landed on her
Last
dress.
week.
There was perhaps the most infamous incident involving
Yes, it's all done.
dresses, one that didn't even occur in Great Britain. On December 8th, 1863, a fire broke out in La Iglesia de la Compañía de Jesús in Santiago, Chile. Yeah, I took Spanish in high school.
What? Yes, the final
death
day
toll
was
is
last
estimated
week.
to be between 2,000 to 3,000 people, with the overwhelming amount of those deaths being credited towards the crinoline dresses that most of the women were wearing that night. Yeah, they weren't the direct cause of the fire, but with so many poofily dressed women fleeing towards the exit at once, people were tripping left and right, frantically trampling over each other's bodies in an attempt to save their own lives. The fire quickly swept across the flammable fabric masses, consuming the crowd. A wall of human bodies blocked the only exit, trapping any hopeful survivors inside before the entire roof caved in on them. Yeah, you didn't think a story about dresses would get this tragic, did you? Luckily, people began to realize the downside of the fashion trend, and by the late 1860s, just over a decade after its appearance on the market, crinoline dress shapes began to shrink, shifting any junk to the trunk. Slimmer and much more manageable dress sizes became the standard with the rise of the bustle in the 1870s, much to the dismay of the local undertakers.
God, what's that? Let's go.
The last thing you want to think of after proudly painting your house is,
Did I just poison my entire family?
unfortunately, that's a question that many fellas in the 1800s had to ask themselves. Also why they had the audacity to paint their walls green. But not just any green, Sheila's green. Invented in 1775 by one world-renowned Swedish chemist, Carl Wilhelm Scheele. That's Sheila, like the tank. This guy had a huge amount of discoveries under his big smelly belt, including various elements like barium, tungsten, chlorine, and even oxygen. During one of his daily routines of faffing about with various dangerous chemicals, he managed to accidentally create the new pigment. Damn, that's green as fuck. Carl spent the next few years perfecting the synthesis and formally published the recipe in 1778, though he warned of some potential health issues down the line should it be mass-produced. You see, this shade of green was made from acidic copper arsenite. Arsenite? That sounds like arsenic. Yes, it does. 'Cause it is. Although very toxic, it was believed at the time that only those who directly ingested this stuff would be susceptible to its side effects. And you wouldn't slam down a big bucket of tasty green goop, would you? No. After inventing the shade of green, Sheila unfortunately turned a shade of blue as he passed on from this world in 1786 at the age of 43, luckily before seeing the consequences of his creation. With the recipe now published, manufacturers were looking to turn that green into gold. And by the early 1800s, Sheila's green was used as a colorant in a wide variety of products, including dyes, paints, books, wallpapers, dresses, and of course, children's toys. Yeah, everyone wanted their own bit of green. Hell, even Queen Victoria herself had her own green wallpaper to admire. With such substantial demand, factories pushed their workers hard to meet that quota. And this is when the health risks became apparent. Factory fellows working with the arsenical dye reported various sores and symptoms related to arsenic poisoning, though they were largely dismissed or silenced. In the late 1850s, medical reports began circulating highlighting reports of arsenic poisoning from wallpaper. Now, homes back in the day didn't have the sophisticated climate control we have now, especially when it comes to humidity. So a common problem with wallpaper was that it would get all moist and moldy. When this happened, the wallpaper would let off a toxic arsine gas, which slowly poisoned the homeowners. The paper was also susceptible to flaking, with bits of green getting snorted into your airways and into your lungs. And that's no good either. While toxic, arsenic also has the bonus property of being carcinogenic. It gives you cancer. It's estimated that thousands of people were either dead or dying from arsenic poisoning across the early and mid-1800s. People got sick, but knowledge surrounding arsenic poisoning itself was not clearly defined, so doctors often misdiagnosed the ailments, attributing them to something entirely different. Hi, well, there's a problem, boyo. You've been fingering too many leprechauns. Aye, so true. But the nail in the chromatic coffin came in 1861 with 19-year-old Matilda Schurer. She was a flower maker. With the boom of industry on everyone's doorstep and their surroundings getting grayer, browner, and sadder, people yearned for the reminders of the brilliant colors of nature, mainly flowers. So naturally, this opened up the market for artificial flowers. An element of the false bouquets were leaves. What color are leaves? No, come on, tell me, what color? Green, that's right. Sheila's green dyes were dustified and applied to fabric leaves to give them that vibrancy. Well, just like the flaking wallpaper, that dust nestled itself in workers' internals, causing crippling illness. Matilda reportedly had oozing sores across her skin where she handled the dust, with the whites of her eyes turning green and even violently vomiting bright green liquid. She sadly died on November 20th, 1861. With all these green symptoms, doctors could no longer ignore the reality. Sheila's green was deadly. Word spread and consumers dropped their green goods. Dresses were dumped, wallpapers were ripped from their walls. By the 1870s, manufacturers were forced to use less vibrant but arsenic-free greens in their products. It's not easy being green. Jumping back to the theme of prim and proper fashion in the Victorian age, one way to appear as an upstanding member of society was to keep your head up. Literally. A straightened posture was praised amongst the societal types. But why train yourself to keep your neck straight when you could just have your clothes do it for you? This is where the stiff high collar came in, and for a while, it had a chokehold on men's fashion. While giving fantastic circulation restricting support, it also served a secondary purpose of providing its wearer with a crisp and clean appearance. You see, with the many layers of Victorian fashion, undershirts were mostly covered up, save for around the length of your neck. Getting your clothes cleaned was expensive and time-consuming. Why clean a shirt that barely anyone sees anyway when you could just give the illusion of cleanliness? High collars were detachable by design, so instead of washing an entire shirt, you just needed the collar to look clean. The collars were ironed and heavily starched, making them extremely rigid, able to keep your chin up even if you're feeling down. But these restrictions and constrictions led to some afflictions. For one, these things were just plain uncomfortable. By the late 1800s, the collars pretty much reached the jawline, further exaggerating the posture to the point of ridiculousness and therefore danger. Even physicians at the time warned of the inherent problems of the collars, including their tendency to put too much pressure on the carotid arteries. Those are the ones that supply blood to your brain. Don't want to be blocking them things. Although a rare occurrence, it was still a risk. Unfortunately, it was a risk that took the lives of a few unlucky gents. In September of 1888, a young fella by the name of John Cruzy drunkenly passed out on a bench one night in Druid Hill Park in Baltimore, Maryland. According to his autopsy, John was slumped over with his head drooping forward, pushing his stiff high collar into his neck, which cut off his air supply and choked him to death. There was also the case of William Dillon, who was found dead in his hotel room. He died from asphyxiation after severe indigestion had swollen his neck in his sleep, compressing it to his collar. Yeah, it's a really stupid way to go, but fashion back then was more about class than comfort. Luckily, the age of the stiff high collar was about to fold. Shifts towards more casual, comfortable clothing began to take hold in the 1920s and the 1930s. You also had the electric washing machine make its way to market around the same time, so dirtbags could now clean their shirts and no longer needed their collars. Thankfully, the high collar remained out of the spotlight for a while. But then that shit came back to haunt us in the 2000s. God, I could practically smell the Axe body spray.
Whoa. What's that? I just built a budgeting app in Base 44.
Guys, Nina just built an app.
Impossible. Nina can't code. Interesting. Can it generate reports?
It can now.
Nice. So you're saying we can all build apps now?
Yeah.
I'm on lunch. I gotta make a call. I'll be in my office. Just built an inventory tracker.
Protein calculator.
Book share an app.
A workflow manager that
Tracks who still owes for